The power of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 1 through 3. Let us not forget that as Christians, we are royal priests, regardless of our circumstances. Even when our lives are in turmoil, and we face trials and temptations daily, let us not forget that we are children of God. The key to Ezekiel's strength. Ezekiel was taken captive to Babylonia along with King Jehoiakim. In other words, he was taken to Babylon during the first wave of captivity before the complete destruction of Judah. Verses 1 to 2 tell us that 5 years and 5 days had passed since he was taken captive, and he was now 30 years old. When Ezekiel was 25 years old, he was taken to Babylon, and 5 years had already passed. From the day he was taken captive, Ezekiel counted the days and made notes of special events. These records became the book of Ezekiel, which is essentially his spiritual diary. Ezekiel spent the prime of his life as a captive by the Kebar River in Babylon. As he approached the age of 30, the dreams he had in his youth in Jerusalem seemed to be buried in the relentless passage of time. The Israelites who were taken captive to Babylon were put to work on the canal construction along the Kebar River. If Ezekiel had filled his days with only the forced labor assigned to captives, the book of Ezekiel might not have survived to this day. But Ezekiel had an inner strength. What was the source of his power? In verse 3, Ezekiel identifies himself as a priest. When he was taken captive at the age of 25, he would have been the right age to begin his duties as a priest in the temple in Jerusalem. However, instead of receiving priestly training for 5 years in Jerusalem, he spent those years as a captive. What meaning could being a priest have for a captive? What significance could a long robe have for a worker on a construction site? Ezekiel must have wondered if his life would end without any meaning. Yet, the fact that he called himself a priest indicates that although he could not serve in the temple in Jerusalem, he did not lose his identity as a priest. This was the key to his strength that allowed him to see beyond the tragedy and envision a greater purpose. People have limitations, but God does not. One of the realizations that Christians come to as they live their lives is that it is not about never failing, but about having the strength to rise again after failure. The ability to overcome the overwhelming sense of disappointment that comes after failure with faith is more valuable than success. For Ezekiel, the belief that, "I am a priest," was his eye of faith. There are no people who possess exceptional abilities that prevent them from failing in any situation. Consider David. He was a hero in battle, but he was not successful in managing his household. Solomon was a man of great wisdom, but he was not strong in his faith. Ultimately, the worship of idols in Israel was largely Solomon's responsibility. A person who never fails in any aspect of life is an unrealistic character. Therefore, for Christians, it is essential to have a heart that quietly looks to God amidst the uncertainties of life. Ezekiel did not give up even though his youth was shattered as a captive. He held on to his identity as a priest and wrote a daily spiritual diary, quietly seeking God's will. This was the essence of his faith. In Psalm chapter 62, David said that even when the world is greatly shaken, he remains unshaken and looks only to God. David could only look to God because he saw the world through the eyes of faith. How we view the world and how we judge situations are crucial issues for Christians. The experience of seeing heaven open and seeing reality through God's will. Finally, God opened the gates of heaven to Ezekiel, who valued the eye of faith that saw himself as a priest even during his captivity. When heaven opened, Ezekiel saw the vision that God showed him. The phrase, "heaven opened," does not mean that heaven suddenly split open and something appeared. Instead, it means that Ezekiel was able to see his miserable captivity in a new, spiritual light. When heaven opened, he could view the destruction of his homeland and his own miserable fate through a completely different perspective, the eye of faith. This is the experience of heaven opening. To a Christian, even when a situation appears to be over, it is not the end for God. Even when it seems as if the last turning point has passed, God has not yet passed the turning point. The opening of heaven means that we can see the world from God's perspective. In other words, we can understand reality through the eyes of faith. This means that we see the world not as it appears, but with an awareness of God's will, which governs history. This is the meaning of the phrase, "Heaven opened, and I saw the vision of God."